Well, it seems like quite a few people were fans of my last 80s luxury car video featuring the 1980 to 84 Oldsmobile 98. So I thought I'd do the Buick counterpart, and this is the Buick Electra for 1984, its final year in rear-wheel drive form before it would be downsized to front-wheel drive in 1985. And yes, the name for this vehicle is not the Park Avenue if you have the upper end trim, it's the Electra Park Avenue. Park Avenue was still a trim on these Buicks, and that would in fact be the case all the way until 1991, when Park Avenue actually became the nameplate as opposed to just being a trim level of an Electra. Regardless, as I mentioned, 1984 would be the last year for the big-bodied rear-wheel drive Electra that rode atop a 119-inch wheelbase and was 221 inches in overall length. This is a bit longer than the LeSabres, which rode atop a 116-inch wheelbase, 115.9 to be technically correct about it. And in fact, the Electra estate wagons, though they were badged Electras, actually rode atop the LeSabre wheelbases and were shorter in overall length and wheelbase than the Electra sedans by about 0.8 of an inch in overall length. So that was something that was relatively common across GM and Ford both, that the wagons were actually on the shorter, lower-end wheelbases to be common across all divisions as opposed to being on the longer wheelbases. And in 1984, if you wanted a Buick Electra or Electra Park Avenue, you were going to pay a base price of around $13,300 for the Electra sedan, the lower-end version, which actually Buick called the Electra Limited. The Park Avenue was the upper-end trim that's stickered for about $15,000, and that represents about $40,000 to $45,000 base price in today's dollars. Of course, almost everything was optional as well back then, even on these types of vehicles. So you could get the sticker up close to $20,000 on the Electra Park Avenues relatively easily if you wanted. And Buick ended up selling about 75,000 of these Electras in its last year. Now, a lot of my viewers would comment that the front-wheel drive Electra that preceded this rear-wheel drive Electra was kind of a flop and GM should never have done it. But the fact of the matter is that the front-wheel drive Electra far outsold the rear-wheel drive Electra in 1985 when it was introduced, when it sold almost 150,000 units, virtually doubling the sales volume of the rear-wheel drive Electra. And yes, it was a bit of an elongated model year for the 1985 Electras as they went on sale in April of 1984, but still, they were great sellers. And in 1983, the penultimate year of this rear-wheel drive Electra, GM actually sold about 100,000. So the sales were starting to taper off for the big rear-wheel drive cars, and it was probably time for a change for a car that had been around since 1977, more or less. So for 1984, you have this super handsome Buick Electra, and I think there's a number of things that make it Buick. Of course, all the GM full-size cars from this era had what GM designers would call the sheer look styling, which is that very crisp line look to the overall vehicle, very different from the 1986 Taurus and Sable Jelly Bean look, with a very formal roof line similar to the 1976 to 79 Cadillac Seville. And that was purposeful because GM stylists wanted to convey luxury even in these less expensive offerings, and that Seville was so successful that the styling really just trickled down. And the exterior, I think, is overall handsome. One Buick signature you can see out back here would be the wall-to-wall taillights that started really on Buicks. If you look in the 1960s era, I think some of the most beautiful treatments are on the 1967 Buicks, the Rivieras, and my particular favorite would be the Wildcat Coupe. You can see these relatively wall-to-wall taillights. And that theme would carry on even to the Buick Riata of the late 80s and early 1990s. And some of the Buick show cars, even in the 1990s, had wall-to-wall taillights. So that was a Buick character trait, and I think it gave the cars an overall handsome appearance. You can also see on this Electra at the rear, it has a bit of a vertical motif. And a number of the GM divisions were trying to emulate Cadillac in a number of ways. So Buick, as I mentioned, had these wall-to-wall taillights, but you do get a hint of that vertical profile with those rear quarter panel peaks. And Oldsmobile emulated Cadillac in a bit different way with the vertical tail lamps, as opposed to having those rear quarter panel peaks. So some visual cues that gave buyers that this was an up-level vehicle. Everything from that vertical rear signature to the formal roof pillar. And overall, I think it was a handsome sedan. Now, under hood in these vehicles, there really wasn't anything spectacular. There were two engines available in 1984. The first was a Buick-sourced 4.1-liter, 252 cubic inch V6. They had 125 horsepower. This was a derivative of the Buick 3.8-liter V6, but it's before a balance shaft was put in the engine, which occurred with the 3800 nomenclature's introduction in 1988. And Buick had done some things to smoothen the engine a bit. It was a 90-degree V6 based on the aluminum V8 that was introduced in 1961 that was eventually sold to Rover, actually, and powered many different Rovers, including Land Rovers, Range Rovers for many years. But this Buick V6 was based on that, and hence its 90-degree V architecture. And that endowed it with a rough running characteristic, which Buick tried to smoothen out with some staggered crank throws, which worked to some degree, but not like the 3800 engine. And these engines also had some lower end issues. I wouldn't say they were 200,000 mile engines. They might go, 120, 130,000 miles or so, but the lower ends tended to have a few challenges. And the optional engine in this model year was the Olds 307 5-liter V8 that you can identify by the oil fill tube that's sticking straight up. Was a pretty good motor, made 140 horsepower in this model year in application. It really, either engine in this car was kind of a slug, though. The Electras weighed almost 4,000 pounds, and if you got the estate wagon, it weighed 4,300 pounds. And when you're talking about 125, 140 horsepower, and neither motor had a ton of torque either for the size of the car. It's not like these are big block engines, so they're kind of pokey. You're not going to get anywhere very fast with these cars. But the Olds 307 tended to be very reliable. I've seen those engines go couple 100,000 miles plus. They are very smooth and quiet. So I think overall, they're not a bad engine, and they did get good gas mileage. You could get 23, 24 miles per gallon freeway at 65, 70 miles an hour, which for the time was very, very respectable. Now let's turn to what I think is the best part of these Electra and Electra Park Avenues, and that is the interior. Now, the first thing that you're going to notice in the interior is that many fake plastic trees gave their lives for this interior, and what a tragedy it may be. This clearly has a lot of fake wood all over the place, and it's not all that convincing. GM was one of those companies that I don't think really ever did fake wood convincingly well, at least during this time period. Ford actually, I would say, their fake wood, it had some texture to it. It wasn't totally smooth like you see here in the Electra Park Avenue, and it was actually pretty convincing, I would say, and very tasteful. But Chrysler and General Motors just never seemed to get the faux wood grain thing quite right, and this interior suffers a bit from that, although I would say that it's still handsome. The instrument panel area, you can see that there's 3 gauges, the fuel gauge, the speedometer, and then the shift indicator. Nothing really special here, and the steering wheel is unique to Buick. There was different steering wheels used, whether you got a Chevrolet, Pontiac, Olds, or a Buick. Although Olds did use this wheel with the Oldsmobile logo on it very early on the downsized front-wheel drive cars, but didn't stick around for very long. You can also see here in the interior these poofy seats in this Electra Park Avenue. You could get these in both leather or here velour, and they are just so sublimely comfortable. Now, the standard Electra interior was also quite plush. It just didn't have this loose cushion look to it. And I will say, having ridden in these vehicles, that the seats are more comfortable than your living room sofa. And the cars drive overall very, very quietly. It's just a wonderful experience. I wish the engines had a little more oomph under hood, but again, just phenomenal. This does also have Buick's unique automatic climate control system that you can see there, as opposed to Oldsmobile's Tempmatic system, which forced you to select the fan speed and the mode door. This Buick system was fully automatic, so it would select the fan speed, it would select the mode door, you selected the temperature, and it was generally a good system, but I personally prefer the manual climate control. One interesting feature about these interiors, aside from the wonderful velour and poofy seats, is that Park Avenue logo that's above the glove box on the passenger side, that area actually was backlit, illuminated at night. And I thought that was just a classy touch that was so rare and such a rare detail for cars during that time period, before or since. But it looked great at night, and I think that it was well worth the money that Buick spent. You can also see in this vehicle Buick's supersized gas pedal, which was different from Oldsmobile's supersized gas pedal. Why GM thought it was necessary for divisions to have their own gas pedals, I don't know. But both Buick and Olds had huge gas pedals during this time period, making you think that you were commanding something more powerful underhood than what was really there. And overall, I will say these cars are sublimely comfortable. There's even quite a bit of rear seat legroom, as you can see. And these vehicles had similar dimensions on the interior, if not a bit bigger in some areas, than their predecessors, the 71 to 76 generation. There's a lot better packaging in these vehicles, and they didn't have as much tumble home, and they had more formal roof lines, were a bit taller, so you got more interior roominess, and the trunks were also roomy at about 20 cubic feet. It's unfortunate they don't make cars like this anymore. I think that a lot of automotive journalist articles that were written just dissuaded companies from making these vehicles because they were so universally panned by journalists of the time, who deplored their handling characteristics and the poofy seats. But I don't know about anybody else who's watching this channel. That's frankly what I love about these vehicles. There just aren't cars that are made anymore that are set up for ride over handling. Maybe you could argue that the last Buick LaCrosse was a little bit of that. Made in that vein, but it's super, super rare nowadays for a car to be set up for something that is more emphasized ride over handling. And I think that's just a tragedy, because the roads certainly haven't gotten any better in the intervening decades. And instead, we're all driving vehicles where our fillings rattle as we go over bumps. Well, not on every car, but quite a few of them. Regardless, these Buick Electras from the early 80s are wonderful vehicles, and in 1985, the LeSabre was still rear-wheel drive. That was the last year of the rear-wheel drive LeSabre, and the LeSabre had a limited edition, which actually used the Electra Park Avenue interior. So if you want the Electra Park Avenue on a little bit of a budget, you can spring for a 1985 LeSabre Collector Series. And Olds did something similar with the Delta 88 in that year, and put the really nice 98 Regency interior in the 1985 Oldsmobile 88 Royale Brome. Those would represent the last of the big rear-wheel drive Oldsmobiles and Buicks. Hope that you enjoyed this spotlight on the early 80s Buick Electra Park Avenue. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.